Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. The first person to notice something wrong was a young girl named Sophia, who was 7 years old at the time and living in the Battambang Orphanage in northwestern Cambodia. She woke up one morning before dawn, her thin blanket tangled around her legs, and saw through the window a small boy running across the courtyard below. He moved quickly, his bare feet silent on the concrete, his clothes dirty and torn. What made her sit up and press her face against the glass was not the boy himself, but the fact that the early morning sun, just beginning to rise, cast long shadows from the trees, the fence, the water pump, but nothing at all from the running child. She watched him disappear behind the kitchen building, and when she blinked, she realized her hands were trembling. The orphanage had been built in the late 1990s, a 2-story structure with peeling yellow paint and rusted iron gates that creaked whenever the wind pushed through. It sat on the edge of Battambang city, close enough to hear the morning markets, but far enough that the children felt isolated, as if they lived in a place the world had forgotten. There were 42 children living there at the time, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, all of them without families or with families, too broken to care for them. The staff consisted of 5 women and 2 men, most of them older, all of them underpaid and exhausted. The building itself had been a small school once, before the wars, before the chaos, and the walls still carried faint chalk marks from lessons that no one alive could remember. The courtyard was a square of cracked concrete, surrounded by a low wall, with a single mango tree in the corner that provided shade during the hottest part of the day. The children played there every afternoon, kicking around a deflated soccer ball or drawing pictures in the dust. It was the only space they had that felt like theirs. Sophia had lived there since she was 4, after her mother died from an illness no one could name, and her father disappeared into the countryside, never to return. She was a quiet child, thoughtful and careful, the kind of girl who noticed things others missed. She had a habit of sitting by the window in the dormitory, watching the courtyard, counting the birds that landed on the mango tree. She liked to keep track of patterns, of routines, because routines made her feel safe. So when she saw the boy with no shadow, it disturbed her in a way she could not explain. She told herself it was a trick of the light, that maybe the sun had not risen high enough yet, that maybe she had imagined it, but the image stayed with her all morning, sitting heavy in her chest like a stone. At breakfast, she mentioned it to her friend Dara, a 10-year-old boy who slept in the bed next to hers in the shared dormitory. They sat together at one of the long wooden tables in the dining hall, eating rice porridge from chipped bowls. Dara listened carefully. His spoon paused halfway to his mouth, and then he set it down and leaned closer. He told her he had seen the same boy 3 days ago, running through the courtyard just after sunset. He said the boy had looked directly at him through the window, and his eyes were dark and empty, like holes burned into paper. Dara said he had not told anyone because he thought it was a dream, but now that Sophia had seen him too, he was not so sure. The two of them sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the other children eating and talking around them, fading into a dull hum. Then Sophia asked if anyone else had seen him, and Dara said he did not know, but they should ask. So they did. Over the next few days, they quietly spoke to the other children, careful not to let the staff overhear, and what they discovered made them both uneasy. 6 other children had seen the boy. Some had seen him at night, standing near the fence. Others had seen him in the early morning, always running, always silent. One girl, only 5 years old, said she had seen him sitting under the mango tree, staring at the ground, and when she called out to him, he looked up and smiled, but his smile was wrong, like it did not belong on his face. None of the children had shadows when they saw him. None of them had heard him make a sound. The staff dismissed it when the children finally worked up the courage to mention it. The director, a stern woman named Mrs. Chantha, told them they were letting their imaginations run wild, that they were scaring each other with stories, that if they kept talking about ghosts, she would separate them into different rooms. But the sightings did not stop. They became more frequent. The boy appeared almost every other day now, always in the courtyard, always alone. And then something stranger began to happen. The boy started appearing to specific children, standing near them during the day, watching them from a distance. A 12-year-old girl named Sreymam was climbing the mango tree one afternoon when she felt someone watching her. She looked down and saw the boy standing directly below, staring up at her with those same empty eyes. She froze, her hands gripping the branch so tightly her knuckles turned white, and the boy tilted his head to one side, as if studying her. Then he raised one hand and pointed to the branch she was holding. She did not understand what he meant, but the gesture filled her with a cold, creeping dread. She climbed down immediately, her heart pounding, and ran back inside. The next day, that same branch snapped off the tree during a storm, crashing to the ground exactly where she would have been, sitting. When Sreymam told the other children what had happened, they began to realize something. The boy was not just appearing randomly. He was warning them. Another child, a 9-year-old boy named Panlik, saw the ghost standing at the top of the stairs one evening just before dinner. The boy was facing away from him, his head tilted down as if looking at something on the steps. Panlik stopped walking, his breath catching in his throat, and the ghost turned slowly, his movements stiff and unnatural. He raised one hand and pointed down the stairs, then turned and walked through the wall, disappearing completely. Panlik stood there for a long moment, too frightened to move, and then he heard Mrs. Chantha calling for everyone to come down for dinner. He started down the stairs carefully, watching his feet, and on the 5th step he saw it. One of the wooden planks was cracked, split almost completely through, barely holding together. If he had run down the stairs like he normally did, he would have stepped on it and fallen, likely breaking his leg or worse. He told the staff, and they repaired the step the next day, but no one believed him when he said the ghost had warned him. They thought it was a coincidence. But the children knew better. The sightings continued, and each time the boy appeared to warn someone about something dangerous. A rusted nail sticking out of the courtyard wall, a pot of boiling water left too close to the edge of the stove, a loose wire near the bathroom that could have electrocuted someone. The ghost was protecting them, or so it seemed, but the presence itself was so unnerving, so deeply wrong, that the children began to dread seeing him, even as they understood he was trying to help. The staff finally started to take the sightings seriously when Mrs. Chantha herself saw the boy. It was late at night, and she was walking through the courtyard on her way back from the storage shed. The moon was full, casting silver light across the concrete, and she saw him standing near the fence, his back to her, his small frame perfectly still. She called out, asking who he was and what he was doing outside after curfew, but he did not respond. She walked closer, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and when the light touched him, she saw it. No shadow. The light passed through him, as if he were made of smoke. She stopped walking, her breath catching, and the boy turned to face her. His eyes were dark, bottomless, and his expression was calm, almost serene. He raised one hand and pointed toward the main building. Then he faded, his body dissolving into the air like mist under sunlight. Mrs. Chantha stood there alone, her flashlight shaking in her hand, and for the first time she felt truly afraid. The next morning, she gathered the staff and told them what she had seen. Some believed her. Others thought she had been exhausted, that her mind had played tricks on her. But when the children heard that she had finally seen the ghost, they felt a strange sense of validation, as if their fear had been made real. Then came the final appearance. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, the air heavy with humidity and the smell of rain approaching. The children were in the courtyard, playing as they always did, when every single one of them stopped at the same moment. The boy was standing in the center of the courtyard, fully visible in broad daylight, his torn clothes hanging loose on his thin frame. He was not running this time. He was standing perfectly still, facing the main building, and every child in the courtyard could see him clearly. Sophia was the first to notice that he was not looking at the building. He was looking at the second-floor window, the one that faced the courtyard, the one in the storage room where they kept old mattresses, broken furniture, and boxes of donated clothes. The boy raised both hands and pointed directly at that window, and then he opened his mouth as if to scream, but no sound came out. His face twisted into an expression of pure terror, his eyes wide and desperate, and then he vanished. The children stood frozen, staring at the empty space where he had been, and then they heard Mrs. Chantha shouting from inside the building. She was yelling for everyone to get out, to run, to move now. Smoke was pouring from the second-floor window, thick and black, and within seconds, flames followed. The fire spread faster than anyone thought possible, consuming the old wooden furniture in the storage room and racing through the upper floor. The children ran toward the gate, the staff herding them out into the street, and they stood there watching as the building burned. Firefighters arrived, but by the time they controlled the blaze, the entire second floor was destroyed. The storage room was completely gone, reduced to charred beams and ash. Later, investigators determined that the fire had started from faulty electrical wiring in the storage room, wiring that had been old and dangerous for years. If the children had been inside, if they had been in the dormitory directly below the storage room, they would have been trapped. But they were outside. They were in the courtyard, because the boy had made them stop and look. After the fire, the orphanage was shut down. The building was too damaged, the repairs too costly, and the local government decided it was easier to relocate the children to other facilities. As the children were being moved, Sophia asked Mrs. Chantha if she knew who the boy was, if there had ever been a child who died in the orphanage. Mrs. Chantha hesitated, then told her the truth. 10 years ago, before the orphanage opened, the building had been used as a temporary shelter during a flood. A young boy, no older than 8, had drowned in the courtyard when the water rose too quickly. His body had been found near the fence, and his family, whoever they were, never came to claim him. He was buried in an unmarked grave, outside the city, forgotten by everyone. Mrs. Chantha said she had not thought about him in years, had not even remembered until the sightings started. Sophia listened, her hands folded in her lap, and she wondered if the boy had been trying to protect them, because no one had protected him. If he had stayed behind, bound to the place where he died, watching over the children who lived there because he understood what it felt like to be alone and afraid. She never saw him again after that day, and neither did anyone else. The orphanage remained abandoned, the yellow paint fading further under the sun, the courtyard empty and silent. But the children who lived there never forgot the boy with no shadow, the ghost who warned them, the spirit who saved their lives before disappearing into the smoke and ash. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as chilling as that story was, it is far from the only one. In another part of Asia, something equally disturbing took place. This time, deep underground, where the earth itself seems to remember the past. In the limestone caves of northern Vietnam, where ancient formations twist through darkness and silence, explorers have encountered something that should not exist, a voice that sings in the emptiness, a presence that rearranges the very tunnels around those who dare to search for it. What happened there is harder to explain, harder to accept, and it begins with a sound that no one expected to hear. The expedition team first heard the singing on the third day of their exploration. They were deep inside one of the lesser-known caves near Ha Long Bay, far from the tourist routes, navigating through passages that had rarely been mapped. There were 5 of them, experienced spelunkers and researchers, all Vietnamese except for one French geologist named Pierre, who had been studying the region's cave systems for over a decade. The singing started faintly, so soft that at first they thought it was the wind moving through the tunnels, creating echoes and vibrations. But as they moved deeper, the sound became clearer, more distinct. It was a woman's voice, low and melodic, singing what sounded like a lullaby. The words were old, archaic, a dialect that none of them recognized immediately, though it felt vaguely familiar, like something from childhood stories or half-remembered songs. They stopped walking and stood in silence, their headlamps cutting narrow beams through the darkness, and they listened. The singing continued, echoing off the stone walls, wrapping around them like mist. It was beautiful and deeply unsettling at the same time. The team leader, a man named Min, who had been exploring caves since he was a teenager, suggested they try to locate the source. They moved forward carefully, following the sound, but the further they went, the stranger things became. The singing seemed to shift, moving from one direction to another, sometimes ahead of them, sometimes behind, sometimes directly above. Pierre checked his equipment, his compass and GPS tracker, and frowned. The readings were inconsistent, fluctuating wildly, as if the magnetic field around them was unstable. He mentioned this to the others, and Min nodded slowly, his face troubled. They had all heard stories about these caves, legends passed down through generations, tales of spirits and lost souls, but none of them had believed such things. They were scientists, explorers, people who dealt in facts and evidence. Yet here they were, standing in the dark, listening to a voice that should not exist. One of the other team members, a young woman named Lan, suggested they call out to see if someone was lost down here, perhaps another explorer or a local who had wandered too far. Min agreed, though he did not sound convinced. Lan cupped her hands around her mouth and called out in Vietnamese, asking if anyone was there, if anyone needed help. Her voice echoed through the tunnels, bouncing back to them in fractured waves, and then the singing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, so complete that they could hear their own breathing, the faint drip of water somewhere far off, the creak of their equipment. They waited, standing perfectly still, and then the lights began to flicker. Not their headlamps, those were battery-powered and functioning normally, but the small LED lanterns they had set up along their path to mark their route. One by one, the lanterns dimmed, flared bright, then went dark completely. The team exchanged glances, their unease growing, and then the singing started again, louder this time, more insistent, and it was coming from directly ahead. They moved forward cautiously, their hands brushing against the damp stone walls for guidance, and they entered a larger chamber, a natural cavern with stalactites hanging from the ceiling like frozen tears. The singing filled the space, reverberating off every surface, and they realized with a creeping sense of dread that the voice was not coming from one direction. It was everywhere, surrounding them. Lan whispered that they should leave, that something was very wrong, but Min wanted to investigate further. He was a practical man, stubborn and curious, and he believed there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps there were acoustic anomalies in the cave, natural formations that carried sound in unusual ways. Perhaps someone had set up speakers as a prank, though that seemed unlikely this far underground. He walked toward the center of the chamber, his headlamp sweeping across the stone, and then he saw her. She was standing near the far wall, partially obscured by shadow, her figure indistinct and flickering like a candle flame in the wind. She wore old clothing, faded and torn, the kind that might have been worn decades ago, perhaps during the war. Her hair was long and dark, hanging loose around her face, and she was singing, her lips moving in time with the melody. Min stopped walking, his breath catching, and he called out to her, asking who she was, what she was doing down here. She did not respond. She did not even look at him. She continued singing, her eyes fixed on something beyond the chamber, something none of them could see. Pierre stepped forward, raising his camera to take a photograph, and the moment the flash went off, the woman vanished. Not gradually, not fading away, but gone in an instant, as if she had never been there at all. The singing stopped. The chamber fell silent. And then the ground beneath them trembled, a low vibration that sent dust and small pebbles raining down from the ceiling. They ran. There was no discussion, no debate, just a shared instinct to get out, to move, to escape. They retraced their steps through the tunnels, following the markers they had left, but something was wrong. The passages did not look the same. Turns they did not remember. Forks in the path that had not been there before. Sections of the cave that seemed to stretch longer than they should. Pierre checked his GPS again, but the device was useless, displaying nothing but static and error messages. Min tried to stay calm, to reassure the others, but his voice was tight with fear. They walked for hours, their lights growing dimmer, their water supplies running low, and they could not find the exit. It was as if the cave itself had changed, reshaping around them, trapping them inside. Lan began to cry, quietly at first, then openly, and the others tried to comfort her, but they were all thinking the same thing. They were lost, and they might never get out. Then the singing started again, faint and distant, drifting through the darkness like smoke. This time, it felt different. Not threatening, but guiding, beckoning. Min looked at the others, his face pale and exhausted, and he said they had no choice. They had to follow it. So they did. They walked toward the sound, through passages that twisted and turned, through chambers filled with strange rock formations that seemed to watch them as they passed. The singing grew louder, clearer, and eventually they saw light ahead, real light, daylight, filtering through an opening in the stone. They stumbled toward it, relief flooding through them, and they emerged into the forest outside the cave, blinking in the sudden brightness. They were safe. They were out. But when they checked their equipment later, when they reviewed the footage from Pierre's camera, they found something that none of them could explain. The photograph he had taken of the woman showed nothing, just empty stone. No figure, no shadow, no sign that anyone had been there. Yet they had all seen her. They had all heard her sing. After they returned to the city, they began researching the area, looking for any historical records that might explain what they had experienced. What they found was a story that had been nearly forgotten, buried in old military archives and local folklore. During the war, when American bombs fell on the northern regions and civilians fled into the countryside, many families took shelter in the caves. One woman, a mother with a young child, had become separated from her group during an evacuation. She had gone deeper into the caves, searching desperately for her son who had wandered off in the chaos, and she never came out. Search parties were sent, but the tunnels were too complex, too dangerous, and eventually they gave up. The woman's body was never found. Locals said that sometimes, late at night, you could hear her singing in the caves, the same lullaby she used to sing to her child, still searching, still calling out, trapped in the darkness forever. The team sat in silence after reading the account, the weight of it settling over them like a heavy blanket. Pierre said he did not believe in ghosts, that there had to be another explanation, but his voice lacked conviction. Min said nothing at all, staring at the photograph on the camera screen, at the empty space where the woman should have been. They never returned to that cave. The local authorities were informed, and the entrance was marked as dangerous, restricted to the public. But other explorers have gone in since then, drawn by the mystery, by the stories, and some of them have heard the singing too. Some have seen the flickering figure in the shadows, the woman who searches endlessly for what she lost. And some have experienced the same disorientation, the same sense that the cave is alive, that it shifts and changes, protecting her, keeping her secrets. There are those who say she is not malevolent, that she is simply lost, bound to the earth by grief and desperation, that she guides those who are lost, because she understands what it feels like to wander in the dark, calling out for someone who will never answer. But whether she is a protector or a prisoner, whether she means to help or to keep others trapped with her, no one can say for certain. All they know is that the caves near Harlong Bay hold more than stone and water. They hold memory, they hold sorrow, and they hold a voice that refuses to be silenced. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And while these stories already seem unbelievable, what comes next takes horror to a darker and more mysterious level. Because in the next part, the things that begin as coincidences twist into something far more terrifying, where the line between the living and the dead becomes impossible to distinguish, and where the past refuses to stay buried. The stories waiting ahead will test everything you thought you understood about the supernatural, about memory, and about the places where tragedy leaves its mark forever. The first person to see the woman in white was a British photographer named Daniel, who had traveled to Ahmedabad in Gujarat, specifically to photograph the ancient stepwells that dotted the region. He had heard about the stepwell on the outskirts of the old city, a structure built in the 15th century, descending 5 stories into the earth with intricate carvings along every level. It was early morning when he arrived, the sun just beginning to cast long shadows across the stone steps, and he was alone. He had his camera ready, adjusting the settings for the dim light, when he saw her descending the steps far below him. She wore white, a flowing garment that seemed to catch the faint breeze even though the air was perfectly still. Her movements were smooth, almost gliding, and she did not look up. He called out, his voice echoing through the enormous shaft, but she did not respond. She simply continued downward, deeper into the stepwell, toward the water at the bottom that had not been used in decades. The stepwell was one of hundreds built across Gujarat during the medieval period, designed to provide water during the dry seasons and to serve as gathering places for communities. This particular stepwell, known locally as Rani Ki Vav, or the Queen's Well, had been constructed by a queen whose name had been lost to time, built in memory of something or someone important, though the records were unclear. It was a massive structure, nearly 30 meters deep, with symmetrical staircases descending on all 4 sides, meeting at a central pool at the bottom. The walls were covered in carvings, depictions of gods and goddesses, animals, flowers, geometric patterns that had been chiseled into the stone with painstaking detail. Over the centuries, the stepwell had fallen into disrepair, partially filled with silt and debris, the water stagnant and dark. It was no longer used by locals, and only occasionally visited by tourists or researchers. The area around it had grown quiet, the nearby village mostly abandoned, the old homes crumbling under the weight of time. Daniel had chosen this location precisely because of its isolation, its haunting beauty, its sense of being forgotten by the modern world. He wanted to capture that feeling in his photographs, the intersection of history and decay. He descended the steps carefully, his boots making soft scraping sounds against the stone, his camera held securely in both hands. The air grew cooler as he went deeper, the sunlight fading above him, replaced by shadows that pooled in the corners and crevices. He reached the second level and paused, looking down toward the water. The woman was still visible, now on the fourth level, still moving downward, her white clothing stark against the dark stone. He called out again, louder this time, asking if she needed help, if she was lost. Again, no response. He felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, a sense that something was not right. But he continued downward, compelled by curiosity and concern. He reached the third level, then the fourth, and when he looked down toward the pool, she was gone. He stopped walking, his breath coming faster, and he scanned the area around him. The stepwell was silent, except for the faint sound of water dripping somewhere far off. There was nowhere she could have gone. The only way out was back up the stairs, and he would have seen her pass him, unless she had gone into the water. He approached the edge of the pool slowly, peering down into the murky depths. The water was still, covered with a thin layer of green algae, and he could not see more than a few inches below the surface. He considered calling out again, but something stopped him. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and he had the distinct feeling that he was being watched. He raised his camera and took a few photographs of the water, the steps, the carvings around him, and then he turned to leave. As he climbed back toward the upper levels, he heard something behind him. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing softly off the stone. He turned quickly, his heart pounding, but there was no one there. The steps were empty. He continued climbing, moving faster now, and the footsteps followed, matching his pace, staying just out of sight. By the time he reached the top and stepped out into the sunlight, he was running, his breath ragged, his hands shaking. He did not look back. He returned to his hotel and reviewed the photographs on his camera, and what he saw made his blood run cold. In several of the images, particularly those taken near the water, there was a figure visible in the background. The woman in white, standing at the edge of the pool, facing away from the camera, her head tilted down as if looking into the water. He had not seen her there when he took the photographs. He zoomed in on the image, studying her more closely, and he noticed something strange. She had no reflection in the water. The surface of the pool reflected the stone walls, the sky above, but where she stood, there was nothing, just empty water. He felt a chill run through him, and he closed the laptop, trying to rationalize what he had seen. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, a lens flare, a problem with the camera sensor. But he did not believe that. He had seen her with his own eyes, had heard the footsteps following him, and he knew deep down that what he had encountered was not human. Over the next few days, he spoke with locals in the nearby village, asking about the stepwell, about its history, about any stories or legends associated with it. Most people were reluctant to talk, shaking their heads and changing the subject, but eventually he found an older man, a retired teacher named Rajesh, who was willing to share what he knew. Rajesh told him that the stepwell had a dark reputation, that people avoided it, especially after sunset. He said that many years ago, during a time of war, a young woman had lived in the village, and she had been in love with a soldier who promised to return to her after the fighting ended. She waited for months, then years, but he never came back. No one knew if he had been killed in battle, captured, or if he had simply chosen not to return. The woman, consumed by grief and despair, went to the stepwell one night and threw herself into the water. Her body was found days later, floating near the bottom, her white clothing tangled around her limbs. Rajesh said that after her death, people began seeing her in the stepwell, always descending, always moving toward the water, as if reliving her final moments over and over. He said that anyone who saw her felt an overwhelming sadness, a sense of loss so profound it was almost unbearable. Daniel listened, his hands folded in his lap, and he asked if anyone had ever tried to communicate with her to help her move on. Rajesh shook his head. He said that some things could not be helped, that some sorrows were too deep to heal, and that the woman was trapped not by the place but by her own grief. He warned Daniel not to return to the stepwell, that those who spent too much time there often became obsessed, drawn back again and again, unable to escape the pull of the place. Daniel thanked him and left, but the warning stayed with him. That night he had vivid dreams of descending stone steps, of cold water rising around him, of a voice calling his name from somewhere far below. He woke several times, drenched in sweat, his heart racing, and each time he felt the urge to go back, to return to the stepwell, to find her. He resisted for 3 days, but on the 4th day he went back. He told himself it was for his work, that he needed more photographs, but he knew the truth. He was drawn there, compelled by something he could not explain. He arrived in the late afternoon, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ancient structure. He descended the steps slowly, his camera forgotten in his bag, his eyes scanning the levels below, and then he saw her. She was standing on the lowest level, near the water, facing him. For the first time, he could see her face. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with dark eyes and pale skin, and her expression was one of profound sadness. She did not move. She simply stood there, looking at him, and he felt tears streaming down his face without understanding why. He took a step toward her, then another, and she raised one hand, palm out, as if telling him to stop. He froze, his breath caught in his throat, and she turned slowly and walked into the water. She did not wade or swim. She simply walked, her body sinking beneath the surface, disappearing completely, and the water did not ripple or move. It remained perfectly still, as if she had never been there at all. Daniel stood there for a long time, staring at the water, and eventually he turned and climbed back up the steps. He left Ahmedabad the next day, returning to England. But he never forgot what he saw. The photographs remained on his hard drive, unopened, and he never spoke about the experience to anyone except once, years later, in a letter to a friend who was studying paranormal phenomena. He wrote that he believed the woman was not haunting the stepwell out of malice or anger, but because she could not let go, because she was still waiting, still hoping. And that hope, that refusal to accept the truth, had bound her to that place forever. He wrote that he felt sorry for her, that he wished there was something he could have done, but he also admitted that part of him was grateful he had left when he did, because he felt the pull of that place, the desire to stay, to descend those steps again and again, and he knew that if he had returned one more time, he might never have left at all. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as chilling as that story was, it is far from the only one. In another part of Asia, something equally disturbing took place. This time in a place where the living go to work before dawn, where the smell of the sea mixes with the cries of vendors, and where a small ghost wanders through the aisles searching for something he lost long ago. What happens in the wet markets of Malaysia is quieter, more subtle, but no less terrifying, and it begins with a boy who should not be there. The fish vendors at the Kota Kinabalu wet market knew something was wrong the first time they saw the boy. It was just before 4 a.m, the hour when the market came alive with activity, when trucks arrived with fresh catches from the night boats, when stalls were set up, and ice was spread across metal tables to keep the seafood cold. The boy appeared without warning, walking barefoot between the rows of stalls, his clothes soaked through as if he had just climbed out of the water. He was small, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with pale skin that looked strange under the fluorescent lights, almost translucent, and his hair was plastered to his head, dripping steadily onto the concrete floor. He moved slowly, looking around as if searching for someone, and when one of the vendors, a woman named Lena, called out to him, asking if he was lost, he did not respond. He simply continued walking, his bare feet making wet slapping sounds on the ground, leaving a trail of water behind him. The wet market was one of the largest in Sabah, located on the waterfront of Kota Kinabalu, a sprawling structure of corrugated metal roofs and open-air stalls where locals and tourists alike came to buy fresh fish, crabs, prawns, and other seafood. It operated in the early hours of the morning, from 4 until around 10, and it was a loud, chaotic place, filled with the sounds of bargaining, the smell of brine and fish, the constant motion of people moving between stalls. The vendors were a tight-knit community, many of them working the same stalls their families had operated for decades, and they knew each other well. They also knew the market itself, every corner, every routine, every face that passed through. So when the boy appeared, soaking wet and silent, it was immediately noticeable. Lena mentioned it to her neighbor, a man named Ahmad, who sold squid and octopus, and he said he had seen the boy too, standing near the entrance, staring at the water beyond the market. Ahmed said the boy looked wrong, that his skin had a strange texture, like it had been underwater too long, and that his eyes were dull and unfocused. Over the next few weeks, the boy appeared regularly, always before dawn, always walking the same path through the market, always searching. The vendors began to recognize him, to expect him, though none of them knew who he was or where he came from. Some tried to approach him, to ask if he needed help, but whenever anyone got close, the boy would turn and walk away, moving deeper into the market, toward the back where the stalls were older and less maintained. One morning, a young vendor named Hassan decided to follow him. Hassan was in his early 20s, practical and skeptical, and he did not believe in ghosts or spirits. He thought the boy was probably homeless, maybe mentally ill, and that someone needed to help him. So he followed at a distance, watching as the boy wove between the stalls, past the rows of fish laid out on ice, past the buckets of live crabs and prawns. The boy moved with purpose, as if he knew exactly where he was going, and Hassan struggled to keep up. Eventually, the boy stopped near the back wall of the market, where old fishing nets and crates were piled haphazardly, and he stood there, perfectly still facing the wall. Hassan approached slowly, calling out, asking if the boy was okay, and then the boy turned around. Hassan would later describe the moment to the other vendors, his voice shaking, his hands trembling as he spoke. He said that when the boy turned to face him, He saw his eyes clearly for the first time, and they were wrong. They were clouded over, milky white, like the eyes of a fish that had been dead for days. His skin, up close, looked waterlogged, pruned and discolored, and there was a faint smell of salt and decay. Hassan reached out instinctively, intending to touch the boy's shoulder to see if he was real, and the moment his fingers made contact, he felt it. A cold so intense it burned, shooting up his arm and through his chest, and he heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of waves. Not distant, not faint, but loud and immediate, as if he were standing in the middle of the ocean during a storm, water crashing around him, pulling him under. He stumbled backward, gasping, and when he blinked, the boy was gone, just gone. No trace of him, no wet footprints, nothing. Hassan stood there alone, his arm numb and aching, and he knew with absolute certainty that what he had touched was not human. After that incident, the vendors began to take the sightings more seriously. They started asking around, trying to find out if anyone knew the boy's story, if there had been any accidents or deaths involving a child near the market. What they discovered was a tragedy that had been largely forgotten. 5 years earlier, during the monsoon season, a severe storm had hit the coast, and the sea had swelled, flooding parts of the waterfront. A family had been visiting the market that morning, buying supplies before the storm worsened, and their young son had wandered off while his parents were distracted. No one saw him leave. No one noticed he was missing until it was too late. His body was found hours later, washed up near the docks, drowned. The family had been devastated, and they had left Kota Kinabalu shortly after, unable to bear the memories. The market vendors at the time had mourned the loss, but as the years passed, the story faded, replaced by newer concerns, daily routines, the constant churn of life. But the boy, it seemed, had not left. He had stayed behind, wandering the market, searching. The sightings continued, and the vendors began to notice a pattern. The boy always appeared on mornings when the weather was bad, when rain was coming, or when the sea was rough. He moved through the market as if looking for something or someone, and he always ended up near the back wall, near the place where the old fishing equipment was stored. Some vendors started leaving small offerings for him, bowls of rice or fruit, hoping it would help him move on, but the offerings were never touched. Others tried to ignore him, to pretend he was not there, but that became increasingly difficult, because the boy began to interact with people more directly. He would stand near certain stalls, watching the vendors work, and if someone made eye contact with him, they would feel a sudden, overwhelming sadness, a grief so heavy it brought them to tears. One woman, a vendor named City, said that when the boy looked at her, she felt like she was drowning, like water was filling her lungs, and she collapsed, gasping for air. Her co-workers rushed to help her, and when she recovered, she refused to come back to the market before sunrise ever again. The breaking point came one morning in late September when a tourist, a young Australian man, saw the boy and tried to help him. The tourist did not know the stories, did not understand what he was seeing, and when he saw a soaking wet child wandering alone in the market, he assumed the boy needed assistance. He approached quickly, kneeling down to the boy's level, and he asked in English if the boy was okay, if he knew where his parents were. The boy looked at him, tilted his head to one side, and then he opened his mouth. Instead of words, water poured out, a steady stream that seemed impossible, far more than a child's body could hold. The tourist scrambled backward, horror written across his face, and the boy reached out, his small hand extending toward him. The tourist screamed, a raw, primal sound, and he ran, shoving past vendors and knocking over crates in his panic. He left the market and did not return, and later that day, the local police received a report from a hotel guest who claimed to have been attacked by a ghost. The police dismissed it, but the vendors knew better. After that incident, the Market Association held a meeting. They invited a local bomo, a traditional healer, to come and assess the situation. The bomo arrived early one morning before the market opened, and he walked through the stalls slowly, his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent prayer. When he reached the back wall, he stopped and opened his eyes. He told the vendors that the boy was indeed a spirit, trapped between worlds, searching for his mother. He said the boy did not understand that he was dead, that he was confused and frightened, and that his presence was growing stronger because of the emotional energy in the market, the constant flow of people, the life and activity that reminded him of what he had lost. The bomo performed a ritual, lighting incense and chanting prayers, asking the boy to move on, to find peace, to let go of his search. For a while, it seemed to work. The sightings stopped. The vendors breathed a collective sigh of relief. But 3 months later, the boy returned. He appeared again on a rainy morning, walking through the market just as he had before, leaving wet footprints, searching. The vendors realized then that he could not be helped, that whatever bound him to this place was stronger than any ritual, any prayer. Some believed he was looking for his mother, still hoping she would come back for him. Others thought he was simply lost, unable to find his way out of the darkness. And a few whispered that he was not searching at all, that he was trying to take someone with him, to pull another soul into the water so he would not be alone. Whatever the truth, the boy continued to appear, and the vendors learned to live with him. They avoided him when they could, warned newcomers to stay away, and they never, ever touched him. Because those who did felt the cold, heard the waves, and carried that sensation with them for days, a lingering reminder that some things cannot be saved, and some losses cannot be undone. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The last 2 stories are different. They are quieter, but far more disturbing, the kind that stay with you long after the telling ends. They do not rely on sudden scares or dramatic confrontations, but instead on the slow realization that something is deeply, profoundly wrong. These are the stories that make you question what you know, that linger in the corners of your mind, whispering long after you have tried to forget them. What comes next will take you to places where the boundaries between the living and the dead dissolve completely, where grief becomes something tangible and dangerous, and where the past refuses to remain silent. The first hiker to hear the voice was a German man named Klaus, who had been trekking through the mountains of Kyrgyzstan with a small group of experienced climbers. They were on the 3rd day of their expedition, following an old route along Timur Ridge, a remote stretch of highlands that overlooked deep valleys and ancient forests. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning its descent, casting orange light across the rocky terrain, when Klaus heard someone call his name. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was clear and distinct, carrying through the thin mountain air. He stopped walking and turned, expecting to see one of his companions behind him, but they were all ahead, moving along the narrow path. He called out, asking if anyone had said something, and they looked back at him with confusion. No one had spoken. He stood there for a moment, listening, and then he heard it again. His name, whispered from somewhere in the trees to his left, just off the main trail. The ridge was part of a larger mountain range that had been used for centuries as a trading route, connecting villages and allowing herders to move their livestock between seasonal pastures. It was isolated and difficult to reach, which made it attractive to serious hikers and climbers who wanted to experience untouched wilderness. The path itself was barely maintained, little more than packed earth and loose stones, winding along the edge of steep drops and through patches of dense forest. The trees here were old, gnarled pines and birches that grew at angles, shaped by constant wind, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The group had been warned by their guide, a local man named Oscar, to stay on the path at all times, that the terrain was unstable and the forest could be disorienting. Oscar had also mentioned, almost casually, that the ridge had a reputation, that locals avoided it when possible, but he had not elaborated, and no one had pressed him for details. They were experienced hikers, confident in their abilities, and they did not put much stock in local superstitions. Klaus hesitated at the edge of the trail, peering into the forest. The voice had sounded so real, so familiar, and for a moment he thought it might have been his wife, though that made no sense. She was thousands of miles away, back in Munich, and yet the voice had her cadence, her inflection. He took a step toward the trees, and Oscar called out sharply, telling him to stay on the path. Klaus stopped, turned back, and saw that Oscar's face had gone pale, his expression tense. The guide said nothing more, just gestured for Klaus to keep moving, and the group continued hiking. But Klaus could not shake the feeling that something had called to him, something that knew his name, and the thought unsettled him deeply. That night, they made camp in a small clearing just off the ridge, setting up tents and building a fire as the temperature dropped and darkness settled over the mountains. They ate a simple meal of dried meat and bread, and they talked quietly, their voices subdued by exhaustion and the oppressive silence of the forest around them. Klaus mentioned the voice he had heard, and one of the other hikers, a woman from Sweden named Ingrid, said she had heard something similar earlier in the day. She said it had sounded like her brother, calling her name, and she had almost stepped off the path before she realized how irrational it was. Another hiker, a young American named Tyler, admitted he had heard a voice too, though he had dismissed it as wind or his imagination. Oscar sat across the fire from them, his face illuminated by the flickering flames, and he finally spoke. He said that Timur Ridge was known locally as a place where people heard voices, where the forest called to travelers, trying to lure them away from the path. He said that those who followed the voices rarely came back, and when they did, they were changed, speaking in fragments, their eyes distant and haunted. The group fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them like a heavy blanket. Someone asked what caused the voices, and Oscar shook his head. He said there were many stories, legends passed down through generations, but the one most commonly told involved a woman who had lived in the mountains centuries ago. She had been a healer, a wise woman who knew the plants and the land, and people came from distant villages to seek her help. But during a harsh winter, her family starved, and she was unable to save them. Grief consumed her, and she wandered into the forest, calling out for her husband and children, searching endlessly, refusing to accept that they were gone. She never returned to her village, and people said she was still out there, still searching, still calling. Over time, the story evolved, and locals began to believe that she did not just call for her own family anymore, but for anyone who wandered too close, mimicking the voices of loved ones, trying to fill the emptiness inside her. Oscar said that those who followed her voice were never found, or if they were discovered wandering in circles, dehydrated and delirious, speaking of a woman with impossibly long limbs who had led them deeper and deeper into the trees. That night, Klaus could not sleep. He lay in his tent, listening to the wind moving through the branches, and he heard the voice again, soft, persistent, calling his name. He tried to ignore it, to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks. But the voice grew louder, more insistent, and it began to sound less like his wife and more like something else. Something that was imitating her but did not quite get it right. He unzipped his tent and stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin, and he saw her. A shadow standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the darkness, tall and thin, her limbs elongated and wrong. She was motionless, facing him, and he could not make out any features, just the outline of something that resembled a person but was not. He opened his mouth to call out, to wake the others, but no sound came. He felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot, and the shadow began to move, gliding toward him with a strange, stuttering gait. He forced himself to step backward, stumbling over a tent rope, and the movement broke the spell. He shouted, loud and desperate, and the others woke, emerging from their tents in confusion. By the time they looked toward the edge of the clearing, the shadow was gone. The next morning, they debated whether to continue or turn back. Klaus wanted to leave, his nerves frayed and his sense of safety shattered. But the others were more pragmatic. They had come this far, invested days of hiking, and the idea of retreating felt like failure. Oscar said they would be safe if they stayed on the path, if they ignored any voices they heard. And reluctantly, Klaus agreed to continue. They packed up camp and resumed hiking, but the atmosphere had changed. Everyone was tense, hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in the trees. And the voices came again, more frequently now, calling to each member of the group at different times. Ingrid heard her mother. Tyler heard his girlfriend. Another hiker heard his deceased father. Each time they resisted the urge to follow, but it grew harder, the voices more convincing, more desperate. They began to feel like they were being hunted, stalked by something that was always just out of sight, waiting for one of them to make a mistake. On the fourth day, Tyler disappeared. They had stopped for a brief rest, and when they looked around, he was gone. No one had seen him leave. No one had heard him walk away. Oscar and the others searched the immediate area, calling his name, but there was no response. They found his pack leaning against a tree, his water bottle still full, but no sign of Tyler himself. Panic set in, and they expanded the search, moving carefully through the forest, staying close together. Hours passed, and the light began to fade, and they were forced to make a decision. They could not search effectively in the dark, and staying out overnight without proper shelter would be dangerous. They returned to the trail, set up camp, and planned to resume the search at first light. That night was the worst. The voices came constantly, overlapping, calling multiple names at once, and the shadow appeared again, closer this time, circling the camp just beyond the reach of the firelight. No one slept. They found Tyler the next morning, sitting at the base of a tree about 100 meters off, on the trail. He was alive, but he did not respond when they called to him. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead, and his lips were moving slightly, as if he were whispering to himself. When they reached him and shook him gently, he blinked and looked at them as if seeing them for the first time. He said he had heard his girlfriend calling him, that she had been crying, saying she needed him, and he had followed the voice without thinking. He said he had walked for hours, deeper and deeper into the forest, and eventually he had seen her, standing in a small clearing, her arms outstretched. But as he got closer, he realized it was not her. The figure was too tall, too thin, and her limbs bent in ways that were not natural. He had frozen, terror overwhelming him, and the figure had tilted her head, studying him, and then she had whispered his name again. But this time, it was not his girlfriend's voice. It was something cold and empty, and he had turned and run, stumbling through the trees, falling and getting back up, until he collapsed and could not move any more. He said he did not remember anything after that, just sitting and waiting, unable to think or feel. They decided to leave immediately, abandoning the rest of the trek and heading back the way they had come. Oscar led them quickly, pushing a hard pace, and no one complained. They wanted out of that place, away from the voices, away from the shadow. It took 2 days to reach the nearest village, and when they arrived, Tyler was taken to a local clinic. He recovered physically, but he never spoke about what happened again, and his eyes retained a distant, haunted quality that his friends recognized but could not explain. Klaus returned to Germany and tried to resume his normal life, but he found himself unable to hike anymore, unable to be in forests or isolated places. He said that sometimes, even years later, he would hear his name whispered when he was alone, and he would turn, expecting to see the shadow, but there would be nothing there. Just the memory, the knowledge that something in those mountains was still searching, still calling, still waiting for someone to answer. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But if you thought the mountains held the only shadows that reach out to the living, you would be wrong. Because sometimes the most terrifying encounters happen not in remote wilderness, but in the heart of a modern city, where millions of people move through their lives unaware that something ancient and hungry is waiting just beneath the surface. The final story takes place in Tokyo, in the tunnels that cut through the city like veins. And it involves a girl who refuses to stay hidden, who appears in mirrors and reflections, demanding to be taken home, even though home no longer exists. The taxi drivers in Tokyo knew about Tunnel 3 long before the media picked up the story. It was an unspoken rule among the night shift drivers, the ones who worked the late hours when the trains stopped running and the city's drunken office workers needed rides home. They avoided Tunnel 3 whenever possible, taking longer routes, ignoring passenger complaints about the fare, because the alternative was worse. The tunnel itself was part of the Shibuya Expressway system, a stretch of road that ran underground for about 2 kilometers, connecting the busy commercial district to the quieter residential areas on the outskirts. It was well lit, well maintained. Nothing about it seemed unusual during the day. But after midnight, things changed. The first reported incident involving the girl in the tunnel occurred about 8 years ago, when a driver named Takeshi picked up a fare near Shibuya Station. The passenger was a businessman, clearly intoxicated, and he gave an address in Setagaya, which required driving through Tunnel 3. Takeshi hesitated, but it was late, he was tired, and he needed the fare, so he took the route. The tunnel was empty, no other cars visible ahead or behind, and the fluorescent lights overhead created a sterile, yellowish glow that made everything look flat and lifeless. About halfway through, Takeshi glanced in his rearview mirror to check on his passenger, and he saw her, a girl, perhaps 13 or 14 years old, sitting in the back seat next to the businessman. She had not been there when the passenger got in. She wore a school uniform, plain and dark, and her hair hung loose around her face, obscuring most of her features. But what made Takeshi's breath catch was her eyes, or rather, the absence of them. Where her eyes should have been, there were only smooth, empty sockets, skin pulled tight across the hollows. He jerked the wheel instinctively, the car swerving slightly, and the businessman cursed, asking what was wrong. Takeshi looked back at the mirror, and the girl was still there, sitting perfectly still, her head tilted slightly toward the passenger, as if studying him. Then she turned her head, slowly, until she was facing the mirror directly, facing Takeshi, and her mouth moved. He could not hear her through the barrier between the front and back seats, but he could read her lips. "Take me home." He slammed on the brakes, the the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the tunnel, and the businessman shouted in alarm, demanding to know what was happening. Takeshi turned around in his seat, looking directly at the back, and the girl was gone. Only the businessman sat there, confused and angry, and Takeshi realized his hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel. He apologized, muttered something about feeling dizzy, and drove the rest of the way in silence. He never took Tunnel 3 again. When Takeshi told other drivers about what he had seen, some dismissed it as exhaustion or stress, but others nodded knowingly. They had heard similar stories. A driver named Yuki said she had picked up a young couple one night, and while driving through Tunnel 3, she had seen a girl appear in the rearview mirror, standing in the road behind the car. Yuki had looked over her shoulder, but the road was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the girl was closer, as if she had moved forward impossibly fast, and Yuki had accelerated, her heart pounding, and the girl had vanished. Another driver, an older man named Hiroshi, said he had seen the girl sitting in his back seat when the car was empty, waiting at a red light just before entering the tunnel. He had gotten out of the car and opened the back door, but there was no one there. Yet when he got back in and looked at the mirror, she was visible again, staring at him with those empty sockets, her mouth forming the same words. "Take me home." The stories spread quietly through the taxi driver community, passed along during breaks at dispatch stations, shared in online forums dedicated to urban legends and unexplained experiences. Some drivers tried to investigate to find out who the girl was, but information was scarce. The tunnel had been built in the early 1990s during a period of rapid infrastructure development in Tokyo, and there were no records of accidents or deaths involving children during its construction or in the years since. However, one driver, a younger man named Kenji, who was more tech-savvy than most, managed to dig deeper. He found old news articles archived online, and he discovered a story that had been buried, overshadowed by larger events. 15 years ago, a middle school girl named Aiko Matsuda had gone missing while walking home from school. She had last been seen near Shibuya Station, and despite extensive searches, her body was never found. Her disappearance had generated significant media attention initially, but as months passed without leads, the story faded from public consciousness. Her case remained unsolved, her family left with no closure, no answers. Kenji shared this information with other drivers, and they began to piece together a theory. If the girl in the tunnel was Aiko, then perhaps she was trapped, unable to move on, searching for a way home. The phrase she repeated, "Take me home," suggested she was lost, confused, possibly unaware that she was dead. Some drivers felt sympathy for her, believing she was simply a confused spirit, but others were terrified, because the encounters were becoming more aggressive. Drivers who ignored her, who refused to acknowledge her presence, reported that she would not simply disappear. She would slam against the car windows, the sound of fists pounding against glass echoing through the enclosed space of the tunnel, and the drivers would see cracks forming, spiderwebbing across the surface, even though no physical impact should have been possible. One driver, too frightened to continue, pulled over inside the tunnel and refused to move until the police arrived, but by the time officers reached him, the girl was gone, and the only evidence of her presence was the shattered rear window. The situation escalated when a passenger, a young woman named Natsumi, experienced the encounter firsthand. She had been in a taxi driven by a man named Satoshi, and they were passing through Tunnel 3 late one Friday night. Natsumi was on her phone, texting a friend, when she felt a sudden drop in temperature. The air inside the car became icy, her breath visible in front of her, and she looked up from her phone in confusion. In the rearview mirror, she saw a girl sitting next to her. Natsumi screamed, scrambling away, pressing herself against the door, and Satoshi immediately pulled over, his face pale. He knew what was happening. He had heard the stories. The girl turned her head toward Natsumi, her empty eye sockets somehow conveying an intense, desperate need, and she reached out one hand, her fingers brushing against Natsumi's arm. The touch was freezing, burning cold, and Natsumi felt something else, a flood of emotions that were not her own. Sadness, confusion, loneliness, and an overwhelming desire to go home, to find her mother, to be safe. Natsumi sobbed, the intensity of the feelings crushing her, and the girl leaned closer, her mouth moving. "Take me home." And then the windows began to rattle, vibrating violently, and the girl's expression changed, twisted, becoming angry, frustrated, and the rattling turned to pounding, the glass cracking under the force. Satoshi did the only thing he could think of. He started driving again, accelerating through the tunnel, ignoring traffic laws, desperate to reach the exit. The pounding continued, louder and louder, and Natsumi curled into a ball, covering her ears, crying. The girl in the mirror screamed, her mouth opening impossibly wide, and the sound was not human. It was a wail of pure anguish and rage. And then, as the car burst out of the tunnel into the open night air, the sound stopped. The girl was gone. The temperature returned to normal. Natsumi sat up slowly, her body shaking, and she looked at Satoshi with wide, terrified eyes. He did not say anything. He just drove her home. And when she got out, she left without paying, without speaking, and he did not stop her. He understood. Some experiences could not be measured in yen. Natsumi reported the incident to the police, but they dismissed it as a hallucination, possibly caused by carbon monoxide or stress. She knew they were wrong, and she began her own investigation, reaching out to other people who had experienced something similar. She found dozens of accounts, spanning years, all describing the same girl, the same tunnel, the same desperate plea. She also found Aiko's family, and she met with Aiko's mother, an older woman who had never stopped searching for her daughter. Natsumi described what she had seen, and Aiko's mother wept, saying it sounded like her daughter, that Aiko had always been afraid of the dark, had always needed to know she could get home safely. She said that after Aiko disappeared, she had gone to Tunnel 3 many times, standing at the entrance, calling her daughter's name, hoping for some sign, but there had been nothing. Natsumi asked if there was anything they could do, any way to help Aiko move on, and her mother said she did not know, that she had tried everything, prayers, rituals, offerings, but nothing had worked. The encounters in Tunnel 3 continue to this day. Taxi drivers still avoid it when they can, but sometimes they have no choice, and when they pass through after midnight, they watch their mirrors carefully, their hands gripping the wheel tightly, waiting for the moment when the air turns cold and a girl with no eyes appears in the back seat. Some believe she is searching for her mother, trying to find her way back to the life she lost. Others think she is trapped, bound to the tunnel by the circumstances of her death, doomed to repeat her final moments forever. And a few whisper that she is no longer just searching, that she has become something else, something darker, something that feeds on fear and desperation. Whatever the truth, the girl remains, her plea echoing through the underground, a voice that will not be silenced, a presence that refuses to fade. Take me home. The words linger in the minds of those who hear them, a haunting reminder that some journeys never end, and some souls never find peace. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.